Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue with Chapter 11, Post-War America, and we're going to cover Part 4, Politics in the 1950s. Now, we've already mentioned this before, post-World War II America was becoming very conservative, both politically as well as culturally. We discussed that in the last section. The country was experiencing prosperity, and the people wanted it to keep going. President Truman wanted to continue FDR's policies, but had problems doing that. The country was moving from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, and that was difficult. During the war, everyone had jobs because we were building so many weapons, tanks, planes, battleships, aircraft carriers. We're not doing that anymore, so there's many less jobs available. So you're going to see a little rise in unemployment along with all the soldiers coming home. Unfortunately, the women who were working in factories that had jobs lost their jobs and they had to go back home themselves. So now we mentioned earlier how people did without during the war. Now they wanted to buy goods. You know, we mentioned that as before as the American dream. Inflation drove up prices, but wages didn't go up as fast. There's a lot of workers out there, so there's not as many jobs available, so that keeps wages down. Now, workers demanded higher wages and went on strikes to get them. Remember the last section we mentioned how so many workers now were members of unions like the ALF-CIO, and they wanted better wages. We see strikes hitting the automobile, the coal industry, steel, electric, and even the railroads. Truman tried to end the railroad strike by drafting railroad workers into the army. And then he was going to order them to go back on the job and thus end the strike. Congress said, you really can't do that. Now, Congress, if you remember, we discussed this back in the 1920s. People saw unions as being communist. You know, there's a lot of connections there. And Congress forced union members to sign non-communist oaths. And they also passed the anti-union law called the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, Truman had vetoed it, but then they overrode the veto, so it was put into place. This was a law that restricts the activities and power of labor unions. Truman also wanted to give more civil rights to African Americans, more voting rights. He was from Missouri, which has always been kind of perceived as somewhat of a southern state, though not a deep South state. And he always felt that African Americans should have more rights. So Truman decides to end segregation in the military. Remember we discussed World War II, how the military had been segregated, the Navy, the Marines, the Army especially, you know, separate units. So Truman decides to end all that. He was actually shocked by the stories of African Americans, World War II veterans who were being attacked and beaten in the South. So he issues Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, which abolished discrimination, quote, on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin in the United States Armed Forces. We just had the, I think it was the 70th anniversary was just celebrated of this executive order. Now, black soldiers and white soldiers would fight side by side, as you see here in this photograph. It ended segregation just in time for the Korean War. Now, Southern Democrats were angry over this, and they became very angry with Truman. And you're going to see this is going to play out later on. Now we're going to talk about Truman's fair deal. Truman wanted to carry on FDR's policies, but the Republican-led Congress fought him. Congress was led by who they called Mr. Republican, Robert Taft. Congress won elections, the Republicans, the Republicans won elections, and they started to reduce government. Taft was the oldest son of former President Robert H. Taft. He lost the nomination to be the Republican candidate for president 3 times. He was one of his goals was to become president, but something always went wrong and he never got the nomination. He was voted one of the 5 greatest senators in U.S. history. Now, while all this stuff is going on with Truman, the public opinion of Truman starts to go down. It's very low. And unfortunately, as 1948 starts coming, to a close, there's an election for president. The election of 1948, Truman, who became president after FDR died in April of 1945, now he has to run on his own for election, all right? He picks Alben Barkley to be his vice president. Now he's going to run against a Republican, Thomas Dewey. Dewey was the governor of New York. Dewey was a moderate governor. He easily beat the conservative Mr. Republican, Robert Taft, for the nomination. The Republicans felt that after FDR's 4 wins in a row, they wanted to get someone who's a little more moderate because they thought that might be the way to win, and Taft was seen as too conservative. Now, this was Dewey's second try to win the presidency. He ran against FDR in 1944 and lost. Now, along with Truman and Dewey, we have a third person running, William Wallace. He was a very liberal progressive. He was FDR's vice president before Truman. So he's going to run as the liberal progressive. Now, Wallace's 1948 platform opposed the Cold War policies of Truman. He was against the Marshall Plan. He was against the Truman Doctrine. Basically, it was the idea of let's just worry about America again. And to round it all out, we have a fourth candidate. Now, I mentioned how the South was very upset with Truman's civil rights policy and his executive order that desegregated the military. Well, Southern Democrats didn't like this, and they chose Strom Thurmond. Now, he ran as the states' rights pro-segregationist candidate. They were called Dixiecrats. This is kind of a play on the word Democrats, but instead of demo, they're going to use the word Dixie, which is kind of a nickname for the South, and in some cases, the South, the Confederacy. So they're called Dixiecrats instead of Democrats. So we have 4 people running. That's not going to be easy. So Truman not only has to defeat the Republican, he has 2 other Democrats, one who's going to be very strong in the South to go up against. So this does not look very good for him. So the Democrats, they will pull votes away. So this is not going to be an easy election. Now, as I mentioned, it didn't look good for Truman and the Democrats. The Republicans had taken control of both houses of Congress during the 46 midterm elections. You see this political cartoon here, and with the cartoon character of Dewey saying, what's the use of even going through with an election? Everyone really thought that Dewey was going to win and Truman was going to lose. Plus, the polls showed Truman trailing Dewey by double digits. So things looked really bad. Now, Truman's going to run against the Republican Congress. Truman calls them the Do-Nothing Congress. He traveled around the country by train. He gave speeches in train stations. Big crowds would show up to hear him speak. While he was giving his speeches, people would yell at him, give him hell, Harry. So he was starting to get his message across as he traveled around the country. But however, polls still showed Truman trailing Dewey. So things really looked bad, September into October. Truman actually went to bed on election night believing he had lost, like everyone else. But Truman defeats Dewey in the end, 303 to 189. This was a newspaper, the Chicago Tribune. They decide to cheat and print their headlines up, figuring that Dewey was going to win. So they printed up their headline the night before and printed their newspaper. Someone gave Truman a copy of the newspaper. He liked to hold it up for reporters to take pictures, showing how he lost. Now, Truman won. What happened is he went to bed at 11 o'clock. He figured he had lost the election, though it was a lot closer than people thought at the time. There were three key states: Ohio, Illinois, and then later California, which comes in, more like the middle of the night. And they came in for Truman. So in the end, Truman won the popular vote, 49.5% to 45%, and he took 28 of the 48 states. You can see the Dixiecrats pulled in 4 of the Deep South states: Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina. So, and they actually took, I think it was 7.5. The popular vote, they got 2.5% of the popular vote in the country down in the South. These were the pro-segregationist, the states' rights, the racist people in the South who did not want to see the blacks get any rights. So they're not going away. Now, Truman did not have as much success in his second term. The Fair Deal only had some successes, and then the Korean War starts in 1950, and then that leads to a lot of conflicts with Douglas MacArthur. Remember, he ended up firing him. There was also the McCarthyism going on. So with all that, Truman decides he's not going to run again in 1952. He couldn't today, but he could in 1952. I'll tell you about that in a minute anyway. Truman decides not to run in 1952. So he and his wife, Bess, return to Independence, Missouri. They, go back to their little house here. My wife and I visited here. It's a museum now. You can actually see his house. He used to wander the neighborhoods with his cane, just talking to neighbors and everything. So he spent the rest of his life that way. And he died in 1972 at the ripe old age of 88. Of course, the following year, they issued a stamp in his honor. And we have the USS Harry Truman. This was a nuclear aircraft carrier that was commissioned in 1998. It's still on active service today. The last I heard, it was in the Persian Gulf near Iraq and Iran, where there was a lot of problems going on. So the USS Harry Truman, Harry S. Truman, is an aircraft carrier. Of course, what's the aircraft carrier's motto? What else? The buck stops here. Now, the election of 1952. Now, Truman's not going to run. We're going to have all new people here running. Now, without Truman, the Democrats choose Adlai Stevenson. He was the governor of Illinois, and he's not charismatic like Truman. No one's going to yell, "Give him hell, Adlai." Now, the Republicans, right now it looks like Taft is going to get his chance to become president, but the Republicans see an opportunity. Both the Democrats and Republicans are trying to get the World War II hero, Dwight D. Eisenhower, to be their candidate. Eisenhower eventually agrees to be a Republican, and the Republicans choose him as their candidate. Eisenhower, also known as Ike, was a former 5-star general who led, of course, America in Europe during the Second World War. He promised to end the Korean War, and also he chose the anti-communist senator Richard Nixon to be his vice president. Now, in the nomination, Eisenhower narrowly beat Mr. Republican Robert Taft for the nomination. Now, Nixon, the vice presidential candidate, is almost knocked off the ticket before the election. There was a number of accusations of corruption, and there were concern among many of the Republicans that Nixon might cause the ticket to lose. So he goes on TV and he gives this famous speech, an impassioned speech to save himself. It's referred to as the Checkers speech. Basically, he said his 6-year-old daughter, Tricia, had received a little Cocker Spaniel who she decided to name Checkers, and that they were going to keep her. He went on to talk about how they're respectable Republicans and his wife wears a respectable Republican cloth coat, and that they were not, dishonest people, they were good Americans. And the people ate it up. They loved his speech, the Republicans, and Nixon became very popular. Now, a lot of campaign buttons all the way with Adelaide. That doesn't sound bad, but I Like Ike really caught on. So they made these buttons up. They should have kept it. Someone came up with I Like Ike and Dick. I'm not really sure that was thought out very well, but I Like Ike becomes very, very popular. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the Cold War America was becoming politically conservative, and the Democrats were seen by many Republicans as being soft on communism. We didn't win the Korean War, and there was some question about Truman. And of course, MacArthur didn't help the situation much. So a lot of people flocked to vote for Eisenhower. Eisenhower campaigned on what he called Truman's failures: Korea, communism, and corruption. Remember, we discussed the Cold War. Eisenhower wanted to do the rollback policy of pushing communism back and criticized Truman's containment policy. Of course, Eisenhower never did roll anything back, but that's, it sounded good in a campaign speech. Truman and Eisenhower were actually fairly friendly with each other. He was the commander-in-chief during World War II, and Truman was the president, and they actually got along really well. But this ended during the election. Truman was very upset with Eisenhower because he didn't go after MacArthur. Not MacArthur, McCarthy. McCarthy was criticizing Marshall and the Marshall Plan, and Marshall was Eisenhower's really good friend, and they were like generals together in the war. And Truman was upset that Eisenhower didn't criticize McCarthy for his critiques of Marshall. So their friendship kind of ended here. Now, in the election, Eisenhower easily wins 442 to 89. There's Ike. Ike wins the Daily News with his wife, Mamie, right? It was Mamie? Mamie, yeah. Mamie Eisenhower. Eisenhower takes 55% of the popular vote and carried 39 of 48 states. You can see that the Democrats still get the Deep South states, the former Confederate states, everyone here except Virginia, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida. But you can see the Democrats are still very strong in the South. Now, this is going to end 20 years of Democratic presidents. Now, I mentioned earlier that Truman wouldn't have been able to run because the year before the election in 1951, the 22nd Amendment is ratified. The Republicans pushed this through. It would limit presidents to only 2 terms as president. Truman, had he decided to run for a 3rd term, would have been allowed to because they kind of grandfathered him in. They couldn't really put this rule in after he'd already been, would have violated the rules. But he decided not to run anyway, so it didn't really matter. All right, so Dwight D. Eisenhower, the D stands for David. He's from Kansas, and he's our only president from Kansas, and he becomes now our 33rd president. There's little Ike, born back in October 14th, 1890. He was actually born in Texas, so he's not really a Kansas-born president. He was born to a poor family. He's the 3rd of 7 boys. Now, in 1892, when he's 2 years old, the family moved north to Abilene, Kansas, which Eisenhower will consider his hometown. I mean, he grew up there. He went to school there. He went to high school there. So he considers Abilene his hometown. He loved baseball. He played semi-pro. Where is he in this picture? Oh, here he is. All right. He played semi-pro baseball. This is his high school team, the Abilene High School AHS. He was a center fielder. He was pretty good, but he didn't know if he actually wanted to turn pro. That was his actual dream, was to be a professional baseball player like Honus Wagner, one of his idols. He was a shortstop for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Now, because I said this is this Abilene High School in 1908. But he instead went to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He played varsity football there after being cut, unbelievably, from the baseball team. He called that one of his greatest disappointments when they cut him from the baseball team. He later injured his knee playing football and then ended his football career. But he did stay at West Point. Would have been very interesting how history would have gone had he turned pro, and he never would have been General of the Army or President of the United States. He graduated in 1915. Here's his graduation picture. He actually graduated in the same graduating class with Omar Bradley, who was one of the top generals in World War II. Was actually right below Eisenhower in the chain of command. So they actually were friends in the same graduating class. The following year, he married Mamie Dowd. Here's their wedding, well, one right before their wedding picture. They, as you can see, the way she dresses, there was a different style during World War I. He commanded a tank unit after his graduation, but he never saw any action in World War I. Ironically, he never saw any action in World War II. He's probably one of our most famous generals who never was actually in a battle. Now, after World War I, he becomes General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's military aide. Remember when Douglas MacArthur sent the bonus army in to clear all the veterans out during the Great Depression? Eisenhower was totally against it. He disagreed with it. He didn't want to do it. Later, he went with MacArthur to the Philippines, and they really start to dislike each other. MacArthur, of course, is very flashy, outgoing, outspoken, never met a camera he didn't like. And Eisenhower was a lot quieter, a little more reserved. So they really, their personalities really were not the same. Now, in October of 1941, Eisenhower was promoted to be a one-star general. And after the start of World War II, he's quickly promoted to be a two-star general. And in November of 1942, despite never holding a command in combat, Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. There he is, and you can see he's got the 5 stars there. Eventually, he would get 3 stars, 4. They gave him pretty quickly. He was actually rose up in the ranks over a lot of generals who actually outranked him, and he was promoted over them, which a few of them, like Patton, kind of ruffled some feathers. He led Allied forces through World War II. He planned the D-Day invasion. Here he is with Winston Churchill. Here he is talking to some of the airborne troops of the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles before the D-Day invasion. Here he is with Bradley, his classmate from West Point. Bradley's on the left of the photograph. On the right is old blood and guts George S. Patton. Here's a picture after the war. He's standing there with on the left of the photo is the British top general, Bernard Montgomery, and on his right is the Soviet Red Army commander, Marshal Zhukov. You can't see him in the photograph, but just to Zhukov's right is Charles de Gaulle, the French commander. Now, after World War II, Eisenhower retired and became the president of Columbia University. After that, in 1915, he was named commander of NATO. And Eisenhower, at age 62, was the last president born in the 19th century. He loved to play golf. He played golf more than any other president until Trump, our current president, who seems to play golf almost every day. But Eisenhower loved playing golf. That was his sport. He was also a chain smoker, smoking pretty much 3 to 4 packs a day. He finally quit in 1957. He actually, while he was president, had suffered a serious heart attack and spent 6 weeks in the hospital. Now, one of the interesting things is Eisenhower and his vice president, Richard Nixon, really didn't get along very well with each other. Nixon was this young California senator who became vice president, promoting himself, and Eisenhower was more of a moderate. So they really didn't get along. But their kids got along. In fact, his son David, Eisenhower's son David, married Nixon's daughter Tricia. They look so 1950s here, don't they? So that is David Eisenhower and Tricia Nixon, who actually married each other. Now, Eisenhower represented what was called modern republicanism. Eisenhower wanted to limit the power of the president. He believed Congress and the courts should have more power. Kind of goes against everyone up, all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, who felt the president should have more power. Eisenhower believed that we should give a little power to Congress and the courts. He was a fiscal conservative, lower taxes, cut spending. He supported big business. So he's very much, Mr. Republican. However, he didn't want to end any of FDR's New Deal programs. He liked to say that he was a conservative when it came to money, but liberal when it came to human beings. So he wanted to maintain Social Security. He maintained unemployment insurance. He wanted to keep the things in place that Roosevelt put in there to help the people during the Great Depression. So he's not exactly what today we would call your typical Republican who seems to want to cut back on social programs. He wanted to keep the social programs. So that's a pretty good thing that Eisenhower wanted to do. He also expanded Social Security to include more workers. Now, we're going to go into the election of 1856. Eisenhower is extremely popular, and he's going to run against Adlai Stevenson. And like before, he easily defeats Stevenson, 457 to 73. As you can see, I like Ike, very, very popular. And here's Stevenson and Eisenhower shaking hands. It's a lot different than today. The politicians got along a little bit better. Here we see the map. We show that Eisenhower won even bigger than 1952. He carried 41 of the 48 states. You notice the Dixiecrats aren't around anymore. He actually carried 57% of the popular vote. He was very, very popular. Even New Jersey, which was actually a Republican state back in the 1950s, went with Eisenhower both times. And there he is. Okay, so that ends it. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. All right, and I will see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.